This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel on Zoom. Connecticut is among 9 states that doesn't allow no excuse absentee ballots or mail-in voting. Coming up, Secretary of the State Denise Merrill will join us to talk about what she wants Connecticut lawmakers to do to keep voters safe, especially if social distancing must continue during this year's elections in August and November. Now, are you a local town registrar or worker at a polling site in Connecticut? We want to hear from you. That's coming up. First, the governor's office is working on a plan to reopen Connecticut. One of the hardest hit cities is Stamford, with the largest number of confirmed COVID cases in the state. How will Stamford reopen, especially with its close proximity to New York City? Joining us now for our conversation on Zoom is Stamford Mayor David Martin. Mayor Martin, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Lucy. Good morning.
I want to let our listeners know they can join us as well. The number 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. Or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Mayor Martin, I mentioned that Stamford has the largest number of confirmed COVID-19 cases. At this point, more than a month since the state shut down, how many tests does your city need to be testing per week to protect its residents? And where are you right now?
Well, early on, I announced as we were expanding a testing capacity where we were partnering with other private companies and using city resources to do more testing. I said I want 10,000 a week, and I still believe that that's appropriate, the appropriate number, and we're nowhere close to that. And the matter of fact is the testing across the nation is so disorganized and so short that I can't even tell you how many tests we're doing per week. I know that we've been able to get some testing capacity down here, and so we're expanding the testing, but we're a long way away from where we need to be with testing.
So how many drive-through sites does the city of Stamford have, and do any of them offer rapid results, Mayor Martin?
Well, we have a drive-through site with Stamford Hospital. We have a drive-through site that we partner with Murphy Associates at one of our parks, Cummings Park. We have another person that we partner with, but it's not drive-through. And then we had another drive-through site that we had at West Hill High School, but we've shut that down. And instead, this last weekend, we started going to the places where we know that the coronavirus was. So we had 3 we're going to bring the testing to you. And we had lines on Saturday afternoon of, I don't know how many tests were done, but when I was there, we had close to 100 people lined up wanting to have testing done.
When you say that you're going to where people need to be tested, does that mean nursing homes, or tell me a little bit more about this?
Well, so early on, I announced that we were testing all of our first responders. That's fire, police, the people that run the 911, and of course our ambulance service. And we've tested about 550. We haven't gotten to everyone for a variety of reasons. And we discovered about 20 more cases of coronavirus where people were asymptomatic. That is, they had no symptoms, but they did have the virus. And of course, knowing that, we're able to help protect them and their family and their fellow workers, but also protect the public. So that was first on the list. The next thing was we went to the nursing homes and assisted care, and we made an announcement of whether they have testing capacity or not. We now have been able to establish a little bit of testing capacity, and so we offered to test all of the employees at nursing homes and assisted care facilities, and that is in progress now. And some facilities have taken full advantage of that. And as you might expect, some are a little bit slow to respond. It may be that they have their own testing. The last phase of this is that we've been able to finally get through to get some data so that we can actually see the cases that are occurring by address. And in addition to the nursing homes and the assisted senior care facilities, which of course you could guess at, and where we had some data, we now know specific addresses in Stamford, and they tend to be certain apartment buildings, and we are now bringing the testing capacity to that location and saying to every resident in that building, as far as I'm concerned, you've been exposed if you're in this building and we have a half a dozen cases or we have 10 cases in this building, and we are coming to that building and we have the nurses and the doctors and We register you ahead, but even if you don't register, you still come and we'll figure out how to get it done. And if you don't have insurance, we'll get you insurance. And if we can't get you insurance, we'll still do it for free, because this is a public health advantage to find out who it is that's been infected, and to find those people who may be asymptomatic, but in fact don't realize it. It's not necessarily their fault, but they might be spreading the disease until we find out they're positive, and suddenly, the behavior changes. But that's how we fundamentally stop this disease. It isn't just through the contact tracing. It is when you do the contact tracing, are you testing the people that have been exposed? And so you can identify where this thing is spreading and put a stop to it.
When you talk about certain apartment buildings that you're going to and having people tested, are these demographics in terms of, are they older residents, or are they these people throughout your city that are getting this coronavirus?
They tend to be larger apartment buildings where they may not be the richest apartment buildings in the world. They tend to come from the middle socioeconomic strata and the lower socioeconomic strata. It's not that they are older. And what we're finding is the spread of coronavirus doesn't care about your age. The fatalities do. And if you're over 70 years old and you get coronavirus, and if you have other comorbidities, then you are definitely at risk of a fatality or a serious battle with this terrible disease. If you're younger, you still get it and you can still spread it. And so the incident rates, at least what I've seen so far, and I'm not claiming to be the doctor, the incident rates seem to be broad-based, but they do tend to run in the minority communities and the lower socioeconomic communities. But the fatalities are, if you're over 70, you're going to have a battle with this, and you are seriously at risk. So what we were doing is we first were targeting the assisted care facilities that are primarily seniors, but now we're moving to, this is where the virus is. And I don't really care if who's there in terms of their ethnic or their socioeconomic or their demographics. This is where the virus is. Let's go there and make certain that we can test everyone there. And the outpouring of people at the facilities that we went to last Saturday really showed that they are responding to the fact that tests are now becoming available, or at least for us, some capacity of tests are becoming available so that we can help them through this pandemic.
You're hearing Stamford Mayor David Martin here on Where We Live. He's joining us on Zoom. I'm on Zoom today as well. You can join us too, 888-720-WNPR. That's 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. I started off this segment, Mayor, talking about Stamford having the largest number of confirmed COVID-19 cases. How much of that plays into the fact that you're so close to New York City, which has been the epicenter of this disease in this region?
I think that's 90% of it. I believe that we are doing more testing than a lot of communities. I can't tell because I don't have reliable data on how much testing is going on. And if you do more testing, you'll find more cases, and that's part of it. But I would say that you're right, Lucy. We are the closest metro urban center to New York City. We have over 30,000 people getting on and off our train station every day. Well, not now, but was before. And we have a large socioeconomic community that is at risk. And you put those three things together, and we end up with a lot of cases and a lot of fatalities. In fact, I think as of Saturday, we had identified 142 fatalities. And, it's a statistic in aggregate, but at an individual level, it's a loved one, it's a parent or a brother or a son that's lost their life to this disease. And it's tragic. It's absolutely tragic. But what we're seeing, at least with the data that I'm seeing, is that we've got the most cases on a per capita basis. And guess who comes in really close? It's the towns that are just a little bit further away from New York. Norwalk and Danbury and Waterbury all are reporting high incidence of positive cases per capita. But on a fatality basis, while it's terrible, on a per capita basis, we're doing about the same as the rest of Lower Fairfield County. in terms of the fatalities per capita. And we're doing statistically about the same as Waterbury and Danbury. And it doesn't make me feel better, Lucy. It does not. But I think it's an indication that this virus was spreading up the Metro North line, and it was spreading up towards Danbury and up that way. And that's the vector through which it's entering this state. So we're sort of at the tip of the spear and getting blunted by this disease. I think that's a terrible analogy, but we're struggling with it. But I think we're going to come out of this all right, except for, of course, the loss of life that's occurred, and it's devastating. It's devastating.
Well, Mayor, I have to ask, we hear that Connecticut Governor Ned Lamont and others are talking about reopening the state in phases. What's your take in terms of the fact that, you said at the top of the show that you don't even know how many tests are really being given per week. You have people that are still getting this disease, and some are dying in Stamford. How confident are you that your city will be able to reopen in the next month or two? And what's your take on the governor's reopening plans?
Well, I think the governor is mostly in the right direction. And if we can get mostly in the right direction during this pandemic, that's pretty damn good. That's a technical term, Lucy. We are having the trend down in total hospitalization, so that's a good thing. But having said that, as of, I think it was Saturday, there were more than 500 hospitalized in Lower Fairfield County. That's still more than double what it was 1 month ago. So the trend line is down, but it's still very high. In Stamford, I think our 7-day moving average is that we still are reporting about 25 new cases a week, but it is coming down. And now that we're beginning to isolate where the coronavirus actually is, I think we're better able to deal with it. We did not close our parks. We did not close our beaches in Stamford like many communities did. We kept our golf courses open for the most part. And I can tell you very directly, I pivoted our traffic enforcement, our parking enforcement people to do parks patrol. And for 99% of the people, it was not an issue. And I saw hundreds, thousands of people walking through our parks or jogging on our trails and observing social distancing. That's not where the disease was spreading. So at least that for us, we've got our tennis courts open. We've got our golf courses open. We are watching it every single day. And if we can't handle it, and I put out an appeal to my residents, don't force me to close the parks. I did have to take the basketball hoops down, and for a while we had the tennis courts shut down. I had to take the nets down. But in terms of reopening, I think the critical thing is these small businesses, particularly in Stamford. We had a very robust small business environment down here. And I think that by May 20th, inching forward is probably the right thing, but I do call it inching forward. And I don't know what the rules are that the governor is working on, but I think at about that date is probably righteous. And if it's a week later or it's a little bit before, as long as we have some clear understanding of how we're going to reopen. Are the hair salons, when they open, is it going to be that the chairs cannot be more than 10 feet from each other? When the restaurants open, is it going to be a rule that I imposed early in this thing here in Stamford was all of the rooms, if the fire marshal said it was 100 people that could be in that room, I said it's now 50. We cut it in half. Well, is that going to apply to the restaurants? How are we going to put the tables out if we go outdoors? There's a variety of details, and the devil is in the details. But I think generally we're moving. If we inch along in that direction, I think that's the right direction to go. But I can tell you, with more cases of coronavirus here in Stamford and more fatalities in Stamford, we're going to be very, very careful about that. And I will be direct. There's still some question about the schools opening or closing. I don't think we can reopen the schools. I don't think we can switch our learning procedures that quickly. And in addition, the challenge of how do you manage, 22 or 25 or 21 kids in a classroom Should they all be wearing masks? How much should be sanitizing their hands? And to try to do all of that in the last 3 weeks of schools, I think is going to be an insurmountable task. And so we'll probably keep the schools closed. I think that's the right decision. But in any event, we do have to keep the economy going. Stamford has probably been hit harder by the economy, not just because we have more cases and more fatalities, but we had a very robust small business. We have a very robust large business, and both of them have been substantially wounded. And I believe that we're going to end up being one of the most wounded economic cities in the state as well, not just from a disease standpoint, but from an economic standpoint.
Well, we'll be sure to check in with you in the next few months. David Martin, again, is mayor of the city of Stamford. Thank you for joining us today here on Where We Live.
Thank you, Lucy.
Coming up right after the break, are you worried about voting in Connecticut's August primary and the November election because of COVID-19? Secretary of the State Denise Merrill will join us to talk about how her office plans to address this concern and others. And what questions do you have for her? Here's the number, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel on Zoom today. Now, the governor moved Connecticut's presidential primary a couple times. Now the date's August 11th because of safety concerns at the polls during the pandemic. No one knows if those concerns will still be top of mind later this summer. But the state's top elections official says Connecticut lawmakers or the governor could do something to guarantee Connecticut voters the chance to vote safely. And that is expanding access to absentee ballots or mail-in voting. Joining us now on Zoom is Denise Merrill, Connecticut Secretary of the State. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Lucy. Nice to be back.
So we know that this is something that a lot of residents, voters are worried about in terms of voting. You can just look at other states like Wisconsin to see what happened when people are also fearful of catching this virus. This morning, your office is releasing a plan to address voting concerns related to the pandemic. Not only how to keep voters and poll workers safe, but also making elections more accessible to everyone. So I guess let's break it down first, Secretary of State Merrill. Let's talk first about the Safe Polls Plan. What exactly is this, and how are you moving forward?
Well, we should recognize, first of all, that we're facing an enormous challenge. We are having two elections. The first is, as you say, the primary, which is still on. It will be August 11th, along with our statewide primary, which always happens at that time. And we don't really know. The hallmark of all of this is uncertainty. And I think it was ramped up even further beyond what people are already feeling when they saw pictures of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, when they held their primary and miscalculated how many people were going to show up at the polls, because I think they made the assumption that more people would request absentee ballots. So we have to be prepared for either, frankly. And we don't know where we're going to be in August, much less in November for the general election. There are, of course, predictions that we may have a resurgence of the virus by then. So this is our challenge. And we have to also remember with all this that we still have cybersecurity risks going on. There are still foreign actors continuing to launch cyber attacks against election systems throughout the United States. Connecticut's no exception. And so we have to deal with our cybersecurity risks as well. So fortunately, we were able to get some federal funding, thanks to our federal delegation, to help us deal with this one-time situation. And I really want to stress that this is a one-time situation, we hope, and that the plan I'm launching is really specifically to deal with the primary and the general election in the fall. So our first priority is to secure the polling places, because this is why people are fearful of going to the polling places, because of what they saw in Milwaukee and a very real threat that particularly if you're over the age of 65, if you're in certain risk categories, you don't want to risk your health, and no one should have to risk their health in order to vote. So that's our first priority, is to secure the polling places. And that's what our Safe Polls Plan will do. It will have the
There-
municipalities come forward with a plan to adjust polling places if needed. We will help them get cleansing products, safety products, and make sure they have an emergency plan should anything go wrong, and a number of other ways we can help the towns with the federal funding to make the polling places secure.
There are 800 polling sites in Connecticut, is that right?
Somewhere around there. And yes, we will be able to adjust those if necessary. Some of them are very small. I mean, the problem in Connecticut is that we have 169 towns, all very different from each other. Some have about 50% of them only have one polling place, but sometimes that won't be a big enough spot to be able to, take care of social distancing and all the things we've been told to do through an emergency order. So we will allow towns, if they plan ahead, to move polling places in some instances. We'll be very cautious about canceling polling places. You saw what happened in Milwaukee. So particularly in urban areas, I think we'd be cautious about eliminating polling places.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, that would be part of the plans the towns would submit.
You mentioned this plan a couple of times that all municipalities will have to submit to your office. Once they do, they'll get grants to help with cleaning supplies. But what about adding personnel, not only at their elections office, but in terms of poll workers? Many people who, I don't want to say volunteer because they do get paid, but when they're working at the polls, a lot of times they're older, and we know this population is most at risk for this virus, Secretary Merrill. And so I'm wondering, how can the state work to get younger poll workers if, in fact, elections go forth as usual?
Yes, I think that's our biggest challenge. We've known for years that this problem was coming. Most of our poll workers, as you say, are elderly. And for many years now, it's starting to become a problem finding poll workers anyway. So we are going to launch a program from the state level to recruit what I call a new generation of poll workers. And, right now there are lists in the governor's office of people who want to volunteer, people who are out of work, people who are unemployed, students who are home. And so we are going to attempt to recruit volunteers, but we'll be able to pay them with the federal funds. So that will help the towns enormously. So part of the plan they will submit to us will tell us how many new poll workers they need and anticipate. And then we'll be able to try to match up volunteers and others who might want to work in the polls. And it's a great civic opportunity for people. I think right now people do want to help out, and they do want to do these kinds of jobs in their communities. And I think this is a perfect opportunity for us to do just that.
You're hearing Denise Merrill, Connecticut Secretary of the State, as we talk about her plan to make sure that elections in Connecticut, both in August and November, are safe and accessible. If you have a question for Secretary of State Denise Merrill, the number 888-720-WNPR. That's 888-720-9677. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Before I talk about absentee ballots, Secretary Merrill, you keep mentioning this plan that towns have to put forth. We know that our election system in Connecticut is very decentralized. What have you been hearing from local registrars about what they need to make sure that people can vote?
Well, we've been hearing about poll workers. We've had weekly conference calls with registrars and town clerks. You have to remember that town clerks are the ones that process absentee ballots. It's a kind of unusual system, but all offices are brought into this. And so there is, of course, concern that there will be more people wanting absentee ballots, fewer people coming to the polls, but the safety of the polls, the capacity of the polls to accommodate social distancing, these are all big issues for towns. And of course, the cost of all this. So I think our idea, that's why we need so much time in advance to plan all this. You can see this is a big job for the towns. They have to figure out in whatever way they can what they think is going to happen. And it's still an open question as to how many people end up requesting absentee ballots and how many people want to do what they've always done, which is come to the polls. Traditionally, about between 5 and 8% of people vote absentee, and mostly because they're going to be out of town. This section of our statutes that talks about how you can get an absentee ballot if you're unable to get to the polls due to sickness is sort of something no one has used very often, honestly. Now we're anticipating more people will ask for absentee ballots, but that still means we have to have safe polling places, because I still think most people will go to the polls.
People have been asking to have the ability to vote by absentee because they're worried about going to a polling place, as you mentioned, because of that we're in this pandemic. So explain to us again why Connecticut is one of 9 that makes it so difficult, one of 9 states that makes it so difficult to vote absentee, and what do we need to see happen between now and August to give residents more accessibility?
Well, first, I have to explain this again, and it is kind of complicated because Connecticut is one of only, I believe now, 2 states that have provisions for absentee ballots in the state constitution, which is very difficult to change, very long process. It has to be voted on by the General Assembly as a constitutional amendment. Then it has to go on the ballot, and everyone in the state would vote on it. So obviously, we cannot turn on a dime with the state constitution. So those provisions, ironically, I think were put in the 1818 Constitution in order to liberalize voting. At that time, there was no provision for voting except in person at your town hall. And so it's been in place all these years through 2 constitutions. And so far, it's still in place. No one ever anticipated a pandemic. And so now we have to work with that. There's also a statute that regards, how you can get an absentee ballot, who would qualify. The statute is somewhat more limiting than the state constitution. And so we're trying to work with these definitions to be able to enable voters, as I said, not to have to choose between their health and their vote. And I would just say this plan that I'm producing today does not change the law. The first thing I think we're able to do to make this easier for people to get an absentee ballot is we are going to mail an application for an absentee ballot to every eligible primary voter for the primary. And that way, at least people will know what their rights are, know if they fit into the law, and then be able to mail that back. We'll also send them an envelope and a stamp so that they can mail that back and get an absentee ballot from their town. So I think that will help at least clarify for the voters what their rights are and what they should do in this situation. Beyond that, I would need an executive order from the governor or action by the legislature to change the statute. They cannot even change the state constitution, but there are some changes that might be made in statute to help everyone. For example, the governor is very concerned about people over 65 going to the polling places. I don't know if we'll be able to do something about that, but by executive order, he might be able to do that.
So when you mentioned that every eligible voter will be mailed an absentee ballot application, will that happen regardless if the legislature or the governor don't act to make mail-in voting easier?
Oh, yes. An application is mailed. Usually you download them from my office website. Applications can be sent to anyone by my office. This is just an effort to help the towns with the cost of mailing. That's one of the problems at the town level. Our absentee ballot process is full of checks and balances. You have to get an application. You have to mail that application back or take it in. The town clerk then has to check you off a list and then mail out the absentee ballot. You have to mail that back inside a separate envelope. I mean, it's very, very time-consuming and paper-heavy. And so one of the things we thought we could take the burden off the towns was the mailing of these applications. It's very important. We're not mailing out ballots, as they do, by the way, in many states. We are mailing the application simply to simplify the process, at least somewhat, for the towns.
But I imagine, Secretary of State Denise Merrill, that once you mail out those applications, town clerks may be inundated with applications returned to them requesting absentee ballots. And these are people that may not be eligible to vote absentee ballot based on our statute. Is that what you're saying?
No, no. I think there are many, many people who are eligible to have an absentee ballot under our statutes already. I think there are people that want everyone to be able to vote by mail for this election, and that is not only not possible, I don't even think it's desirable, frankly. There are a lot of, it's no silver bullet to voting. For example, right now, the U.S. Postal Service is talking about whether they're going to have the capacity to be able to handle all the voting by mail that's going to go on. But I think in this instance, you have to remember, this is all about the voters. You have to be able to accommodate their vote however we can do it. And it's an emergency situation. This is like nothing we've ever seen. And it's very difficult to anticipate how many people are going to want an absentee ballot. My own personal view is I think a lot of people will still want to go to the polls to vote, particularly in the general election. So we're just going to have to do the best we can under these very uncertain circumstances. And we will have federal money. Part of this money is designed to be able to hire extra help in the town clerks and the registrar's offices should they need it to process people's votes. So I think that should take care of it. And that's why we're having every town submit a plan as to what their needs are. And we will reimburse any costs that they might have that's due to this COVID situation.
Secretary of State Denise Merrill is on Where We Live today to talk about her plan again to make voting more accessible, but also safe for both voters and poll workers. You can join our conversation, 888-720-WNPR. That's 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Isabel writes on Twitter, please implement vote by mail. Oregon is a model for this approach. So Oregon is one of these states that has all mail-in votes?
Yes, that's correct. And actually, their voters express the most satisfaction with their voting process in the country, and they have the highest voter turnout in the country. And they are one of about, maybe 7 or 8 states now that do, I wouldn't say entirely vote by mail. They do still have an election day process. But now I think California, for example, about 80% of people vote either by mail or early. That's another form of voting that Connecticut still doesn't have, and that is other days of voting, which really does facilitate, the voting process. Most states now, I think 33 or 35 states have early voting and or vote by mail. And I should describe the Oregon circumstance because it's so foreign to us in Connecticut. But basically in Oregon, if you voted in the last election, you are mailed a ballot. Not an application, a ballot. You then fill it out. You can ask anybody you want to fill it out. People describe it as sitting around the dining room table and talking about who you're going to vote for. Everybody fills out their ballot and mails it back or drops it off in ballot boxes, which are sometimes on street corners. So, and that's how they process everything there. Now, I will say we could not do that right now, even if we wanted to. They have a lot of processes. Technology has helped them. They have ways of checking signatures, for example. I know there's concern in Connecticut about would there be fraudulent ballots floating around. They have a signature checking process. They have technology that helps process the ballots as they come in. They have machines that open the ballots, flatten them out, make copies and all that. So we have not developed any of that because we have never gone that direction in Connecticut.
To go back to action by either the governor or the state legislature, what are you hearing, Secretary of the State Merrill, in terms of, will the governor, have you talked with the governor's office in terms of him putting out an executive order that, again, would help expand accessibility to absentee ballots? And what about the legislature? We know they're not meeting right now because of the pandemic. How would they be able to vote in special session? I'm just wondering what kind of conversations you've been having with state leaders.
We've been having many conversations with state leaders about all of this. There's support, certainly, for the voters. I really think people's hearts are in the right place. The governor has spoken frequently about his concern about people, particularly over 65, not going to the polls, not working at the polls. And so we're just all trying to work within the law to figure out what we can do to define this in a way that would include those people, should they choose to want an absentee ballot. That's the other factor, the human factor here. We don't really know how that's all going to work out. And I would go back to the Milwaukee example. It was interesting because they assumed they'd have a lot of absentee ballots. They closed something like 3/4 of the polling places in the cities. And then what happened was, apparently the absentee ballots didn't get in time. And a lot of them were left in the US Postal Service offices and never got delivered. So they ended up having huge numbers of people come out to vote in person. So there's all kinds of things we have to account for here, including those kinds of eventualities. And that's why we need so much lead time for all this.
I wanted to go back to something that you raised briefly about questions about voter fraud. That is a concern that some residents have if absentee ballots or mail-in voting was expanded. But what about intimidation? We've seen certain cities like in Bridgeport where you have campaigns hiring people to go around, getting people to either ask for absentee ballots and then talking with them about who they think their candidate, which candidate would be best. And, people worry about that kind of coercion that happens. How would you address that?
Yes. Well, first of all, I would point out that nothing that I'm suggesting is changing the law at this point. It's really too late for that. We can't do that quickly. So we're working within the law as it is, and we're doing absentee ballots the way we always have. And as I described it, lots of checks and balances. So nothing about that is changing. We're just anticipating there might be more of them. As far as, this idea that there's coercion by campaigns, particularly in cities, against frail elderly and housing projects and facilities for the elderly, assisted living, I think it is a very real problem. And there is federal law involved that requires all places that have certain facilities to have supervised absentee balloting within those facilities. Again, it's not a perfect solution, but there are lots of laws regarding this sort of thing. I would also remind people that in places that do vote by mail, trying to talk people into voting for your candidate is not against the law. And so here we consider that fraud, whereas in Oregon, it's expected that people will be talking to lots of people about who they're going to vote for. The coercion aspect is real, though. And as I say, federal law requires supervised absentee balloting. Those buildings are defined by local registrars as to which ones they are. And so it goes back to the fact that this is all administered at the local level and overseen by registrars, one from each party, to make sure it's fair. So we are doing supervised absentee balloting. It is another problem for this year because the emergency order also instructs us not to send people into nursing homes and other places where frail elderly are residing. So that's something else we're going to have to deal with through either an executive order or some interpretation of the law. But and people have been prosecuted. And in fact, there are investigations ongoing as we speak. The Election Enforcement Commission actively investigates these allegations of coercion, and that's completely appropriate.
One quick question from Facebook before we head to break. Megan writes, is early voting prevented by our Constitution or statute? Can we extend polling over a week to allow for fewer people at one time at the polls?
The answer is yes. I have been fighting for a decade now to get the legislature to remove this language from the state constitution and just leave it in statute where I think it belongs. And now here we are in this situation where our laws are very inflexible. Early voting is another problem in Connecticut. Yes, the law in Connecticut is in the state constitution, which says we can only vote on Tuesday in November. There was a bill passed this year, a constitutional amendment, that would allow Connecticut to have between 3 and 5 days of early voting, depending on how the legislature decided. But that also only passed by a bare majority, which means it has to go back to another legislature. They have to pass it again, and then it would go on the ballot in 2022. That would be the soonest we could change that provision.
I wanted to take a quick call. Michelle's calling in. Michelle, go ahead. You're on Where We Live.
Thank you. I want to thank Denise Merrill for the good work that she's been doing. And here's my question. So I've been an assistant registrar in Glastonbury for about the last 5 years, so I very much know how the process works. And what I'd like to know is how poll workers are going to be protected, because as we know, the process is when a voter enters the polling place, he or she has to go up to a table and give his or her name and address. Then they have to go to a worker who hands the person a ballot. And so, and then the assistant registrars often have to check the identification and the records. And so I don't quite understand how there's going to be social distancing between the voters and the poll workers. And my other question is about same-day registration, which we will have during the November 3rd presidential election. And that, again, is a very involved and complicated process in which poll workers come in direct contact with people who want to both register and vote on the same day. So what are the protections for poll workers?
Go ahead, Secretary of State Merrill.
Yes, that's part of our Safe Polls plan. We will be purchasing with the federal dollars protective equipment for all poll workers in all towns and cities. We will also impose and make the towns impose the social distancing by keeping voters themselves 6 feet apart as they stand in line, which means we may have to move some polling places to bigger areas where there is room to do that. As far as the actual contact, poll workers will have gloves. We will be purchasing pens so that everyone can have their own marking device as they come into the polls and won't have to use one that's been touched by someone else. But the caller is correct. We can't eliminate every contact. It'll be more like what you're going through in grocery stores and other places. But I believe the poll workers themselves will be pretty well protected if we can manage to get all this protective equipment. And fortunately, we have the dollars to be able to purchase all that. So that's very, very fortunate.
You're hearing Connecticut Secretary of the State Denise Merrill here on Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. After the break, how are other states handling their elections and preparing for November during this pandemic? We talked to 538, and you can join us too on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. I've been speaking with Secretary of the State Denise Merrill as we talk about the elections coming up in Connecticut. And joining us now by phone is Nathaniel Rakich, elections analyst at 538. And Nathaniel, welcome to the show.
Good morning. Good to be here.
So we were hearing Secretary of the State Merrill talk about how complicated it is in Connecticut. I'm wondering how other states have been handling this question of expanding absentee ballots, especially in this pandemic. What can you tell us?
Yeah, so, because we have this extremely kind of balkanized system of election administration where the federal government doesn't run elections, but the states and within the states, the, localities do, every state is basically doing something different. You have states like Connecticut that are sending absentee ballot applications to voters. You have states, a couple of states are they've gone the whole way and are switching their upcoming primaries to entirely vote by mail elections. So Nevada, Montana, those are two states that are doing that. You have some states that are doing even less than Connecticut is doing. So for example, there was just a primary in Ohio where they didn't send voters ballots, they didn't send voters applications, but instead they just sent voters postcards on how to request a request for a ballot, essentially. In Ohio, they don't even allow ballots to be requested online. And so as a result, people basically had to write in to get a form sent to them, and then they had to send that form in, which of course was this multi-step process that resulted in many people not getting their ballots in time in order to vote. In addition, obviously, the in-person voting element of things is being scaled back, although that can happen either in conjunction with expanding mail voting or independent of it. So, for example, some states are consolidating polling places, like next door Rhode Island. Some states are kind of leaving things the way that they are and hoping for the best. And other states like Idaho are even closing all polling places entirely, which is interesting and may actually be illegal, because you do have to have there are certain voters who have to vote in person, such as people with disabilities, people who are homeless and can't be mailed a ballot. And so it'll be interesting to see if there are any challenges to states that are kind of taking that extreme approach.
Nathaniel, we have about 3 minutes left, but what I really want to know is, do states have time to set up voting by mail if there's in some way an expansion? We know Oregon and Washington have been doing this for years. They say it takes years to perfect this process.
Right, exactly. So I wrote an article for my website, 538.com, where I looked at how prepared states were, and the vast majority of states are states like Connecticut, where, maybe only 5% of voters voted by mail in past elections. And it's really hard to kind of build up the infrastructure, especially on a short time frame, to vote by mail for all the reasons that the Secretary said. The federal government, its official guidelines for switching to vote by mail, recommends that states start on April 1st for the November election. And obviously we're more than a month removed from that. In addition, as you mentioned, the states that have done it have all said that it basically, it takes years to work out all the kinks in the process. Otherwise, you might get situations like you saw in Wisconsin, like you saw in Ohio, with voters not getting their ballots in time.
I wanted to go back to Secretary of the State Merrill. We just have a couple of minutes left in terms of getting action again to get us ready for August 11th. Even if the presidential primary in Connecticut ends up being canceled, we still have state primary races, don't we?
Yes, we do. Wouldn't be in every town. Many cities tend to have primaries, because any town or city that's a kind of a single party town or city ends up having some primaries. So far, I don't know how many we have slated yet. There's still time for challengers to file. So yes, there will be a primary one way or the other, August 11th.
And someone on Facebook wants to know, Secretary Merrill, where can people sign up if they want to help with helping voters register, or even this vote by mail initiative? Because time is of the essence.
Yes. There will be something on our website within the week where we're recruiting poll workers. Thank you for the question. And really, I would encourage anyone who wants to do something civically engaging, helping your community, sign up. And we will have that up there soon and be able to, hopefully recruit a new generation of poll workers. And I hope you're some of them.
We started the show your segment talking about the Safe Polls plan. When do you need to hear back from municipalities, Secretary Merrill, so that they can get this money to help prepare and even get cleaning supplies for polling sites as they open?
To be honest, I don't know what we've set as a timeline yet. We've been feverishly working just to get the plan together, but it will be soon, as the other caller said, the fellow who was just talking about what happens in other states. Time is of the essence. We need to get these plans in place and get them moving. So I'm hoping it will be soon.
Well, I want to thank Secretary of the State Denise Merrill for coming on today, talking about your plan. We hope to have you back soon. Thanks again.
Thank you, Lucy.
Also with us, Nathaniel Rakich, elections analyst at 538. We'll be sure to tweet out some of his stories at Where We Live. Today's show produced by Tess Terrible. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel on Zoom today. Thanks for listening.